So what I wanted to talk about, or what we're going to talk about today, is we're really going to talk about kind of what's been changing in this admission cycle, so you have a sense of what to expect. We're going to talk about how these trends have impacted college admissions, so you understand what's happening, and hopefully it will reduce some of the stress as opposed to add to it. And then I want to give you guys lots of opportunity to ask questions. You can ask questions in the chat along the way if you have something that comes up. When we get into the end of Q&A, you can just unmute yourselves and ask the questions or do it in the chat, however you feel more comfortable. All right. So first off, the biggest trend that we've seen that's impacted things is test optional. So as most of you know, colleges went test optional during COVID because they didn't really have a choice in terms of doing it. So they were really pushed into doing that at a much faster rate than they would have otherwise. And so what did that do? It led to, hold on a second here. Looks like this, here we go. So most colleges remain test optional through the class of 2023. There are some exceptions. The universities of Florida, Georgia, MIT, and Georgetown are no longer test optional. They really only did it during the pandemic. The UCs went the other side where they went test blind. So for the next 3 years, they're trying out no testing at all, but they will look at AP scores for those students that have it. But otherwise, they are absolutely not looking at testing. So that is one less way to demonstrate academic preparedness for students applying to the UCs. In 2022, only 48% of students actually submitted a test score, so a little bit less than half. The other thing that's happening in testing is that SAT is moving to a shorter, more adaptive digital format, which will launch in the fall of 2023. So for those of you with sophomores, that's something, or I guess rising juniors, that's something that could impact you going forward and taking the SAT.
Could you please try?
And then finally, AP scores can help if the scores are good, but do keep in mind that APs are not required for admissions. So students do not need to submit their AP scores. And in fact, many schools don't offer AP exams, so they couldn't make them required. But we have seen that if a student has a really strong AP score, that corroborates the grade that they got in the score, that can help them in certain instances in admissions. So that's also something to keep in mind. But they're not going to keep track of it if you took the AP or you didn't take the AP exam. So you don't need to worry about that. So what was the impact? So the impact was in the last 2 years, we saw a huge increase in applications. On the positive side, it enabled schools to admit the most diverse classes ever. There's a lot more emphasis put on the transcript, the letters of recommendation, to measure a student's academic preparedness. There's also a lot more impact, or a lot more looking at non-cognitive factors, and we'll go into some of the specifics of how they measure that. Another thing to keep in mind is that it used to be, sometimes if you had a really high test, that could offset a poor transcript. That's not really the case anymore. In some instances, we're seeing it with recruited athletes. The testing can make an advantage, but it's really, really important to have a very strong academic transcript and your GPA. A low test score on the positive side, may not keep you out if the transcript matches the school's profile. And in terms of the impact on whether or not to submit tests, it really depends, like everything else in college admissions, on the school and the applicant, and how testing plays into the overall application. And one thing to note is that colleges have said, like, look, we've gotten really good at reading applications without test scores. So we're able to still make a determination if a student is prepared, even if we don't have a test. So that's a good thing if you're not a good test taker, but if you are a good test taker, it can help you. With regard to this data here, this is something that is directional. We recognize that data is only sort of as good as you have it. But one thing that's to note on this is which schools, what percentage of students were admitted with test scores versus students that were admitted without test scores. So you could see at Northeastern in 2021, it was really at parity. Half of the kids, 50% were admitted with, 50% without. You could see that the blue is 2021, so that was the first year with test optional, and the orange color is this past year. So you see that in some schools it makes more of a difference, in some schools it doesn't. But one thing to note about this data is it doesn't actually say what percentage of students applied without test scores and what percentage applied with test scores. It just tells us what percentage were admitted with and without test scores. So that's also something to just keep in mind. But I think what was interesting to note is that if you look at Tufts ED1 for 2022, it was pretty parity in terms of students that admitted test scores and didn't. Whereas in 2021, it was more skewed to students who were admitted with test scores. So you could see that Tufts is one of the schools that I believe will remain test optional because they were kind of moving in that direction even before COVID. So what's the impact? What does that mean? So that's Abby's turn, right? Abby, you're doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So okay. I'm in an airport, by the way, so you might hear ambient airport noise. But so as Lisa said, test optional policies have led to more applications, which in turn leads to lower admissions rates. So more kids applying for the same number of spots. And many of the select schools saw between 20% and 100% more applications. So the numbers were pretty dramatic. All of that said, our experience was that kids were still getting into great schools. So why did we get so many more, why did the colleges get so many more applications? Test optional. So kids who couldn't access certain schools because of low test scores in the past now went test optional. So did not submit their test scores, but still applied to the schools. Also, during COVID, the schools did a really good job with online resources for helping introduce kids to their schools. Great virtual tours, great online panels, and that really increased their exposure and got kids interested in schools that they wouldn't have been able to really access before. So, and then the overall uncertainty of COVID, the pandemic, test optional policies has kids applying to more schools. And because, you know, it's not clear, the admissions isn't as clear as it used to be without test scores. So really the lesson for all of that, all the increased applications, is you really need a balanced list in terms of geography, financial fit, selectivity. So we're really trying to work towards balanced lists. Another thing that's going on now is more colleges are participating in the Common Application. So a couple of years ago, Maryland went on the Common App, and when they went from their own University of Maryland specific application to the Common Application, their number of apps went up from 32,000 to 56,000. And so that's a big change for them. And this year, two schools that we have a lot of students applying to, University of Washington and UT Austin, have moved to the Common Application, and both of those schools are expecting increased applications of up to 30% more applications. So that's just kind of something to note. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet, but that's what they're expecting. Also, another big change that we've seen is the University of California school system. So acceptance rates have gone down there also, and there's a few different factors contributing to that. One is this increased number of applications overall, but another is policies within the California state government that are increasing the number of spaces for in-state kids. So if you look here at some of the popular campuses from Berkeley to Davis, you can see that admissions rates for out-of-state students have gone down, you know, sort of considerably at some schools. The number of applications system-wide for the University of California schools increased 3.5% from 21 to 22. And there are a few schools that seem to be favoring out-of-state and international kids. That looks like Davis, Irvine, and Santa Cruz, but the other ones are more so taking more in-state kids. And even though the University of California system, as Lisa had said, has gone test blind, meaning there's no place on the application at all. I should have mentioned University of California has its own application. They do not participate in the Common App. And on that application, there's absolutely no place to put your SAT or ACT score. But they do look at AP scores, and anecdotally, that seems to help. High AP scores seem to help.
Right. And just a note on just a little bit of the history of the UCs, and then we'll kind of move on, is that in 2008, so that seems like a long, long time ago, and that was when the financial crisis hit and the California schools needed to get money. So how do they get money? They increased out-of-state students coming in because they're paying substantially more money. So that was a pretty nice gravy train for out-of-state students through 2000, say 17, 18. Then California just passed legislation that they limited the number of out-of-state to 18% system-wide, but some schools like UCLA, Berkeley, and UC San Diego were able to keep the caps that they had, which is about 22% out of state. There's more legislation going into play, and so that's really what's happening and why we're seeing more of a push for in-state students rather than out-of-state students. So just to keep that in mind. But we did see students get into the UCs last year, even with that, but it was really the top students. It was students who had pretty much were in the top 5-10% of their class. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, so the next thing that we need to talk about is, and I just want to make sure that this is mine, yes, is early decision. So what we saw is that early decision is a way for, I think we missed, yeah, okay, is a way for students, for colleges to manage enrollment, because at the end of the day, colleges are businesses, we all know that, and they're looking for ways to manage their enrollment, and early decision is a surefire way for them to say, we know that if we accept this student that they're going to come. So what you may have heard last year, and it happens every year when a new dean of admissions goes and they sort of change their profile. So schools like Northeastern and Tulane used to be sort of assured safety for very strong students, or even for students that weren't quite as strong but had really high test scores. And they spent a lot of money luring students with merit money. Well, they decided that they didn't want to be anyone's safety school anymore, so they moved away from just early action to early decision, and really pushing students to apply early decision so that they can manage their enrollment better. As an example, only, what was it, 112 students, something like that, got in regular decision to Tulane last year. It was like a crazy low amount of people. So early action is the way to apply there. And if you know you want to go to Tulane, early decision is the way to go. The dean from Tulane went to Northeastern last year. So what we saw last year was that where Northeastern was an early action was a really nice sort of likely or safety for a strong student, that wasn't the case. They also were really pushing towards early decision. And so a lot of students were deferred early action where in years past they would have gotten in. So that just makes it more challenging to have those schools where you can really say, okay, this is a good, likely, and safety school. So what's leading to this? It's really data analytics. That's what's driving these decisions, because colleges want to understand how to manage their enrollment, and they need to, and they're using machine learning to do this. So some schools can go as deep as looking at the transcript from a given high school and how that and the grades and the way that a student did in that school, and how does that translate into first year success. They can also predict performance and make decisions about admissions. They also can look at the likelihood of students that will matriculate based on their academic profile, their school, the family income. So that's what you saw at schools like Tulane, Northeastern. And sometimes that's what makes it so complicated, because you think a school, hey, I'm way above the normal profile of a student that's getting into the school. But that school knows that there's no way they're going to yield you as a student. And so that's what's becoming more complicated in it, because yieldability is the new buzzword. Colleges want to know that they could yield you. It's like they want to know that if they accept you, that they're going to come. And because of COVID and everything that happened in the last 2 years, with so much uncertainty and everything that we talked about with increasing applications, yield models were off. And so that's why you're seeing things that just don't make sense in the way that they used to. Many schools did see over enrollment due to COVID. Some saw under enrollment, but many saw over enrollment. And then that was why they pulled back, because we're like, we can't have that many students. We don't have anywhere to put them. There were some schools that were putting kids in hotels. So that's another thing that factors into it. There were some kids that deferred and then came in this year. So we're hoping in the next year or two that the COVID effect will have already been absorbed, and things maybe will go back to a new normal. It's never going to go back to pre-COVID. It's also why, as we said, so many students get denied and deferred from their safety or likely schools. And we've seen that happen where a student's getting denied from a school or deferred from a school. They're like, that was my likely school. If I didn't get in there, I'm not going to get in here. Well, usually that doesn't happen because the colleges also know someone with your profile is more likely to yield at a school that might be a little bit more select or vice versa. So it's really about finding that right list of schools that make sense for you. And the only safeties are truly those schools that just admit by numbers, because otherwise it's just too complicated. For the colleges are just doing too many machinations to figure out who's going to come. They want to know that you will come if they accept you. And that's why we are always recommending that if you are applying to a school that's where you're kind of above the target range, make it very clear what you like about that school so that the colleges understand that you actually would come if you were accepted. So another thing that we're seeing, and we just want to bring up this term, not to make anybody stressed out, but just so you understand some of the terminology that might be going around. You might hear the term highly rejective going around instead of highly selective, highly rejective. This is a school, this is sort of a new term that's been coming in the last couple of years when referring to schools with very low acceptance rate. But we have a pear-shaped admissions, and I just coined this term, so I don't know if it works or not, but if you think about it, you've got the schools at the very top, which are these highly rejectives, but then you have a lot of schools at the bottom that are accepting, 50%, 70%, 80% of their students, and they have not seen the same level of increased applications. They're actually looking for students. So that will present opportunities for some applicants. Those schools often have honors colleges. You can get merit money at those schools. It's great if a student wants to be a big fish in a small pond, if they're planning on going to graduate school and they can do really well there, that can get them to a really strong graduate school. And it's also really good opportunities for students who are late bloomers. So there's a lot of things, with everything that sort of goes this way, there's always something on the other side to look at.
Along with this, and as a way to manage enrollment, schools are also offering alternate enrollment options. So this can mean either a different start date, so a spring start or a summer start, a first year abroad, and then you come back to campus for the second year, or a guaranteed transfer if you start at another school or a community college. And we see that a lot at Tulane, USC, NYU, Middlebury, and a few others, and they're utilizing that more in the last couple of years. And a lot of schools are actually looking to grow their class size, and they can't quite fit as many freshmen as they want to grow the class size. So they're directing students to alternate campuses. So Penn State has a bunch of different campuses, so they're sending kids there instead of to the main campus. So we're seeing a lot of different colleges are being really creative in the way that they're managing their class sizes, but still taking on as many students as they can.
Right. They want to take all of everyone, they want to take all the kids that are good fits for their school, and they just don't have space. So this is just a way for them to manage their enrollment and to give opportunities to as many people as they can. So
yeah, and on the Common App, for some schools, they'll ask the kids if they want to consider an alternate enrollment option. So it's important, if it's something that your student will consider, that they indicate that.
Yeah, and I recommend doing it, particularly like a school like Middlebury. They have what they even have a name for them. This has actually been going on for a long time. They're called Febbies. They start in February, and it's a small school. So if you have more students, if you check that off, it gives admissions more opportunities to let you in and say yes. So the other thing that we alluded to earlier was character. And so character is becoming always been important, but it's becoming even more important in admissions. And we're seeing that through the questions that colleges are asking. So there's different ways that college admissions people are being trained to look at character. And I know we've gone over those at our initial meetings, but just to reiterate them now that you're a little further down the line. So there's intellectual character, which is really looking at how does the student have wonder? Are they curious? Do they have rigor? Is there humility? So the questions that are going to get at that are, describe what developed your academic interest, or is there something that you were in awe of? Something you were in awe of, or a question of like what. Stanford has a question about intellectual vitality. So that's a school that values intellect. Moral is looking at the personal side of things. And this is really important for understanding, are you a good neighbor? Are you going to be a good roommate? Are you going to be a good community member? Are you going to be trustworthy, kind, compassionate? This is also really important. And so there's a lot of questions that we'll get at. They asked a question about, Penn just added a question about, send a thank you note to somebody that you haven't thanked yet, because they want to understand, do you understand and recognize the need for kindness? Civic, this one is huge. And we're going to talk about specifically about these types of questions, but they're really trying to understand. So many schools have added a question about diversity, having conversations with people different from you. What are you going to contribute to the community? Are you going to be a good citizen? Are you going to create a respectful, equitable, diverse community? How will you be part of that? So civic character is really important. And then the performance side is, are you someone who's resilient? Do you have grit? What will you do if something doesn't go your way? Will you be able to manage it? And Miami has a question. They added that, I think, about 3 years ago, which is exactly that. How will you weather the storm, and how can you prove to us that you'll be successful on that front?
So this idea of character being important to colleges, it's always been important, but especially in the absence of test scores. Oops, here's my airport announcement. In the absence of test scores, it's become even more important, because when kids are applying test optional, they have to put more weight on the other variables. So that's, as Lisa said before, transcripts, grades, rigor, but also activities, recommendations, and the other things that demonstrate kids' character. So how do they read for and assess character? So recommendations are very, very important. Now, colleges understand that if a student is at a very, very large high school, that they might not get as rich a recommendation from their teachers with bigger class sizes. And often kids at bigger schools don't know their counselor as well. But for the most part, teacher recommendations, counselor recommendations, and supplemental recommendations which would be from someone outside of academia, a coach, a mentor, a clergy person, a boss. Those things are being very heavily weighted now. In the students' essays, so you have your personal statement that everyone's working on, and also the supplemental essays that each college asks, you can really, our students should be doing a really good job displaying their character in those groups that Lisa described earlier. In your activities, you can really show your leadership, your impact, your collaboration, your compassion, your empathy, your care for your community, your interest in social issues. And then in terms of intellectual character, they're really looking to understand your intellectual curiosity, like how deep are you digging? How intellectually curious you are? What kind of intellectual risks are you taking? And students can demonstrate this through the course selection, how much they challenge themselves, outside reading. And colleges are just really hungry for kids who are interested in the world, putting themselves out there and learning about the things that interest them and that are important.
Right. And be assured that we are making sure that their essays are covering all of these things. So we definitely keep this in mind as we're coming up with ideas with them. You can just quickly read some of these, but these are some ways that colleges talked about how they were able to find character in their stuff.
Yeah, and we're seeing this year, the schools are asking very specific questions about working with people across differences, working with people who are different from you, solving problems with people who are different from you. So, more than ever, it's important that kids are having these experiences so they're, people who can come to these diverse college campuses and get along and make an impact. So that's what the schools are looking for. I mean, let's see. This is how colleges are describing character. Lisa, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, and I think what Abby was talking about was that diversity, equity, and inclusion is in the past 2 years has become even more important in college admissions. And that's why we're seeing so many changes in the types of essay questions that are being asked. Colleges were able to reach so many and admit more students of color and yield them first generation low income students. They want students that can interact with a wide range of people from all different walks of life. And that's why they need students that can get along, they can see varying points of view, have meaningful dialogues about difficult conversations. So you'll see questions that will ask and try to get specifically at these. They want to understand how students are going to contribute to the larger campus community in a diverse way. They want to know if students are going to be change agents for issues facing the world. And this is really reflected in the supplemental essays. And I know it's a lot for any person to have this, all of this responsibility on their shoulders. And so I think it's a lot for your kids, but they're pretty amazing in terms of their ideas and their views and different ways that you can do it. And we always try to help them see the things that they do through a lens of change and through making differences. And that's really where, if we look at some of these questions that Abby will go over and how we might help them think about them in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and sometimes the students, the kids don't even know they've had this experiences until we have a conversation with them. But they're out in the world and they are having these experiences and they're important to them and they're making an impression. So just a couple of examples you can see in the bold. So NYU has this nice long question, but basically in the bold, you see how your experiences would help us to shape and grow our diverse community. So, oops, sorry. If you look down at the bottom, you can see MIT this year is asking one way you've collaborated with people who are different from you. So you can talk about your clubs, your teams, your workplace, but they really want you to address this idea that you're used to dealing with a diverse group of people.
Can you guys mute, anyone in the audience, just mute your screen so that we don't have the ambient noise? Sorry, thanks. Go ahead, Abby.
And you know, in the middle, you can see Syracuse 3 down. They want to know why you're interested in Syracuse University, but that's not enough. They want to know, how do you see yourself contributing to a diverse, inclusive, accessible, and respectful campus? So they're looking for examples of things that our students have done to contribute in that way.
Right. And Lehigh comes right out and asks, that's really the only school that we've seen that comes right out and asks a question about racism. And they make it very clear that they're committed to anti-racist institution and anti-racist qualities. So again, trying to help kids think about things in a larger way. So I had one student who is a future physician, and so as we were chatting about it, and we were talking about different ways that students, people get diagnosed, and seeing his experience that people in lower income communities don't always get diagnosed or don't have the same access to healthcare. So he's going to talk about how he wants to be a provider of equitable healthcare. If someone's interested in the environment, they could talk about, environmental injustice. So there's different ways that they could do it that doesn't always have to be so black and white, excuse the pun, in terms of that particular question. Another thing that you want to just be aware of, and this is just sort of like minor things, and of course we will help with your students, but make sure, a lot of times we always hear, oh, if you major in classics, that's a key to getting into this particular school. But the experience, interests, coursework has to really match the intended major, especially for schools that admit by major. So it's always a good idea, it's always actually a critical idea, that whatever the student is majoring in should be what they're interested in and what they have something to support. Because otherwise it's going to ring false and they're going to know. And not all schools do admit by major. Some just admit straight into arts and sciences and they don't care so much what their major is. Also, it's really good to be aware of which schools have what they call either limited enrollment or major caps. So as an example, University of Washington has a great website, and there's the URL there, and I can share with anyone who wants it later, who actually identifies every single major that is either has a cap on it or has a different way to get into it, and then the ones that are open. So it helps you understand if you see an admission rate of say 60%, but then you understand that for computer science, for an out-of-state admit to University of Washington, it's 3%. So that's lower than getting into MIT. So it's just important to understand that so that your kids are not surprised or you're not surprised. And then it's also good to understand, because just like the UCs aren't accepting more schools, then there's other states that are like, Ohio State's like, bring them on, we want more students. Binghamton's like, bring it on, we want more students. So every year, it's a shift. And so there are some states that are wanting more out-of-state students than others. And then of course the private schools, it doesn't matter where you're coming from. And then just one final thing we just wanted to bring up, because it is something, and it is a trend that is coursing through, sort of the world. But, a lot of teens are suffering from mental health issues and have in the past 2 years. And a lot of kids are talking about it. And we're seeing that definitely in our practice. A lot of kids are really amazing in the way that they've been resilient and been able to manage this. But we're also seeing from hearing from colleges that they're also having to manage that. And they're also having to help kids learn how to socialize, because a lot of kids that are entering college didn't really have the time, didn't take those 2 years, where they were learning all of those socialization skills. And so they're hiring more people, developing programs to help students socialize. And they've also increased mental health support. So socialization, interacting with different people, all of those things, I think everyone's a little bit set back. And we are seeing, though, that people are starting to recover on that front, but just to be aware of that and to understand and help your kids as much as they can wherever they need.